Hunter, what is the first thing that you think of when I say NASA?
The first thing I think of when you say NASA is the space shuttle, probably.
The space shuttle.
Yeah, because I grew up when the space shuttle was an active program, and there was a lot of talk about it in elementary school in particular. And then, of course, there was one particular high-profile disaster in 1986, which I know we'll talk about later. But that comes to my mind immediately when you say NASA.
Yeah, I mean, I think the space shuttle program is very iconic for NASA. I would have accepted any answer. The lunar landing, the creation of rockets, the Apollo program, even up to sort of the Hubble Space Telescope and the James Webb Space Telescope. Any of that stuff, it's all very tied to NASA in some way, or of course the International Space Station, which isn't only tied to NASA, but is certainly has a huge hand in that as well.
Yes.
NASA obviously is a huge force in order to get people up into space and explore space and all of that fun stuff. And so we are actually going to talk quite a bit about NASA today. We're going to talk a lot about space today. And so you might be thinking, well, why are we talking about space on a geography podcast? It kind of flies in the face a little bit.
Right, because geography references the Earth. That's the geo part, right?
Exactly. It's geography is it's Earth centric.
Graphy is writing about the Earth is
exactly.
Geography. It's a loose definition for you. Yeah.
Well, I think to answer this question, the first point of clarification here is that while we're talking about the space broadly, what we're really talking about today is the space race, which very much has an intrinsic geography to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so while we're going to be talking a bit about space as well, and we're also going to be talking a lot about the planet and how we're sort of very perceiving sort of the planet through space and sort of where things are happening with regards to the space race here on the planet. So there'll be some aspects where we're drifting, a little bit into space and we're sort of floating around up there a little bit, but we'll always be tied to the planet in some way.
Well said. Yes.
Thank you. So let's go ahead and break down sort of a little bit of what is the space race, just to understand the term a little bit. And so I think just before we launch into it, this is going to be a 2-part episode. There was just no way to break out sort of the space race into a single episode. There's way too much content. To be honest, I had to go and cut a bunch of content.
Right. This was looking like 3 episodes at one point.
It really was. There's just so much. There's so much out there, and it's like, how do you figure out what stories to tell and not tell? And that's kind of a hard choice to make sometimes.
That's our challenge always.
Yeah, and so the way we're breaking it out in this episode, or in this 2-part episode, is the first episode, the one that you're listening to right now, will be largely focused on the original space race. So this would be the one that happens between the US and the Soviet Union back around the 1960s and 70s. The second one is going to be largely broken out kind of around the modern day space race, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, as well as just some of the more modern events that are happening. And, as with most things, I think what we're going to find is that the original space race, is a little bit more direct in a lot of ways. Whereas the modern day space race has a lot more active players. And so there's going to be a lot more sort of tracking and following within sort of the modern day space race that simply doesn't exist quite in the same way as the one that occurred back in the 60s as all this was sort of ramping up. But really the point is to drive the point to drive across here is that the space race, despite being around space, is really more about a geographic power projection of states around the world as they compete with each other in terms of technology, right? That's kind of the whole thing here, is that countries are trying to show that they are the most technologically improved country, the most technologically powerful country, and in this way, the space race is uniquely geographic in ways that kind of very few things are. I think the closest thing that I could find that would be similar would be the technological race around supercomputers, where countries are always trying to one up each other in terms of supercomputers, and I think now maybe even quantum computers, whatever that might be. I don't know what those are.
I suppose in the background, there's also a military kind of aspect to this as well. So there's this technological race to be perceived as the most advanced, but then there is the interest in military positions, and with satellites and all that kind of stuff comes military advantage. Yeah,
totally. I mean, not to get too far off track here, but if we start talking about sort of GPS, for example, the global positioning system that the U.S. military developed, that's a space-based system. It's a satellite system in orbit. The military advantage that created at the time for the United States was, pretty dominating. Not a lot of other countries could have that precision of where things are going and sort of how to track things. And so absolutely, there's always an undercurrent of military. And that's true for a lot of different things, right? The military is an undercurrent in a lot of different aspects of certainly in the United States, of industries. Before we jump into it, just I wanted to highlight a few sources that I primarily used for today's episode. This is not exhaustive, but these are definitely some of the books that I use. So there was Moon by an author named Ben Moore. There was Rocket Men by another author named Robert Kurson, Rise of the Rocket Girls by Natalia Holt, and Shoot for the Moon by James Donovan. These writers all provided a lot of really good context to help me suss out sort of the modern day space race versus the past space race. Particularly, nice. I would say I leaned mostly on Moon by Ben Moore, because it just has a lot of really good information that really spans the eras and in ways that few of the other books did. And so with that, let's go ahead and talk about kind of the space exploration industry as it was sort of getting started. And really, I kind of want to focus this around the importance of the moon. Because what we're going to find, what we're going to find today, Hunter, is that, well, one, we're going to be talking about the moon a lot. The space race, and I think space in general, always has this undercurrent of the moon being omnipresent.
People have been staring at it for a long time and probably imagining and thinking about how to get there. It figures very prominently in the stories that different cultures tell.
Right. It's our closest celestial object. It's always been up there. You can see it, clear as day, almost sometimes even during the day. There are, obviously the moon might not seem obviously geographic, but it does have some geographic elements, right? So, for example, a lot of life on Earth is attuned to the circadian clock, which is the day-night cycle. But also a lot of life is attuned to the it's called circulunar clock, which would be that it's tied to the lunar rising and setting of the moon, right? So there's that aspect. It also does things like controls tides and all of that fun stuff. So the moon definitely has a huge impact on our planet, and therefore is inherently geographic, even though it's sitting above our planet.
That's a great point. That just because it's not on the Earth doesn't mean it doesn't have a big impact on the Earth, like the sun as well, right? I mean, it's not the Earth, but without it, the Earth would not be. So the moon has a huge role to play in certain aspects of what happens on the planet.
100%. And we could talk a lot more about the moon. We could go through sort of the historic, cultural significances of this, and actually did quite a little bit of research on this, but we're just going to go ahead and skip over that because it's not really attuned to the space race as we know it today. It's just sort of background context. So I think at this point, we're just going to acknowledge that there's a lot that we're not covering in terms of, highlighting the impact of the moon. Instead, we're just going to kind of jump over to maybe some of the evolution of sort of the actual early space race technologies, things that are actually, kind of blasting us up into space, right? So
we can put the moon on our future list, our list of future topics.
I mean, geography as the moon could literally be.
I mean, you've already got a third of the research done right here. It looks like.
I really have. Yeah. Okay. Well, so let's talk a little bit about some of these early technologies. So, Hunter, what's the one thing that actually gets us up into space? Like
rockets, I'm guessing.
Rockets. Yeah. Right. And so have you ever heard that term? What is it? I don't know. It goes something like, it's like kind of like derogatory. It's like, well, are you a rocket scientist or something like that? It's like this idea of like,
or something. It's not rocket science.
It's not right. It's not rocket science.
Not that complicated, right?
Yeah.
Which thereby rocket science is fantastically complicated, is what that suggests, right?
And Sure enough, sure enough, that phrase is born out of the complications that humanity has gone through to develop rockets that could actually work and get people, into space, but also to do other things. So, just to track back a little bit, so the earliest form of rocket propulsion that I could sort of find, and I think this would be, something beyond, catapulting things. Obviously, there was a lot of math involved in that historically, but actual rocket propulsion, earliest back I could track it to was by a man named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, a Russian man back in the 1800s. He wrote more than 400 works, including approximately 90 published pieces on space travel and sort of related subjects around rocket propulsion. Obviously, this was still before the time when there was actual rockets blasting off, but this was sort of the forefront of.
And when was this? When was he writing?
So I have here that some of his studies date back to around 1880.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay.
So this was quite a while ago, right? This was, if you think back to the 1880s, that's, steam power was still very much a thing. Coal was just now being introduced. Thing. There's no coal powered rockets, right? You need a denser.
Yeah, this would be a very steampunk kind of world, right? If we were making rockets in the 1880s.
Right. So, I think a lot of times, if you know anything about this subject, you like to think of rocketry kind of starting, with Germany, and we're going to talk a lot about Germany here in a few minutes, and sort of the scientists involved there. But Konstantin, Russian scientist has been working on this for quite a long time, well before Germany became well known for this. And so, he didn't, as far as I could tell, actually make any rockets. These are all sort of like very early sort of studies looking into this, as a lot of things sort of start out their life. From what I could find, the creation of the first liquid fueled rocket was by an American named Robert Goddard. Goddard successfully launched his rocket on March 16th, 1926, which ushered in an era of spaceflight and innovation. And so, again, this is happening well before Germany and World War II, where many people, I think, try to start the story of rocketry. And there's a very good reason for why the story typically tends to start there. But it's always worth pointing out that a lot of work always happens. There's always a building onto other people's work that happens. Nobody's just sort of creating anything out of thin air, right? Even, Tsiolkovsky and Goddard here, they're building on probably other people's work before them. It's just not quite as direct as, maybe working on early rockets compared to the rockets Germany was creating. But there was something before that. That's
what they mean when they talk about the scientific community. They're talking about contributions that build on one another. Not that everybody even knows each other or anything, but that these ideas are out there and people take those ideas and come up with the next thing and innovate. And
totally,
that's the way it works.
Totally. Yep. So with that, let's just go ahead and jump ahead a couple decades, because we can't really talk about the space race without talking about World War II just a little bit. This is not a podcast on World War II. We're not going to go through any of the battles or anything. But during World War II, Germany did develop something called the V2 rocket. Mm-hmm. And this was developed by a man named Wernher von Braun, who we'll talk about in just a little bit. We'll talk about a little bit more in just a minute here. But the V2 rocket was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. And so the rockets traveled at supersonic speeds, impacted without audible warning, and proved unstoppable. And there was no effective defense against these. And so obviously these were very scary for the Allied forces. And so what ended up happening was, just to skip ahead to the end of World War II, is that when Germany was defeated, there became a sort of race by the United States and other allied, Western allied forces, UK and France mostly, against the Soviet Union to try and capture all these scientists who had been studying this and who had created this very powerful, very intimidating weapon, right? I mean, just imagine how scary it would be that you could just sit there and think at any moment this rocket could just, be here and now we're gone. Very scary technology at the time. And so there was a race to sort of, to borrow from a phrase of Pokemon, catch them all. And that's kind of what they did, right? And so to track back a little bit, talk a little bit about Wernher von Braun. the U.S. would sort of rescue, quote unquote, Werner von Braun from Germany. This was a person who had an intrinsic part of the V2 rocket program. And just to call it out, not to make light of it, but Werner von Braun was a part of the Nazi Party. And even more to that point, he was part of the SS, which was a very brutal part of the Nazi Party.
Yeah, that's the elite squads that started as bodyguards for the dictator and then became kind of in charge of everything, running concentration camps and everything. So that's the darkest of the forces.
Yeah, I mean, I think, suffice it to say, not a good person overall. I would throw that out there. But he would go on to work for the U.S. in sort of their rocketry department. Originally, he would work for the U.S. military, where he worked on more intermediate range ballistic missiles, as well as the Explorer 1 satellite, which would be the first U.S. satellite that goes up into orbit. I also have here that kind of weirdly, he had sort of a short stint working with Disney on creating some films to popularize space travel. So he's sort of branching out a little bit beyond sort of just direct space travel into helping to promote this a about.
So to gain acceptance among the U.S. public.
Right. I mean, yeah, exactly. Because prior to that, he was a war criminal, right? That's sort of the post, what's the word I'm looking for? Washing of his imagery, right? Just to then go on and popularize something that's very popular, which is space travel at the time.
So von Braun was apparently moved to the United States as one of about 1,600 German scientists and engineers under something called Operation Paperclip. And it was directly taking them away so that they wouldn't fall in line with the Soviet Union. In the case of von Braun, for example, became a U.S. citizen in 1955.
Right. And I have here that he would eventually pass away at the age of 65 in Alexandria, Virginia, basically very far away from his home of Germany. He would have a hand in other kinds of things. He would work on the Saturn V super heavy lift launch vehicle that would eventually propel the Apollo spacecraft to the moon. So, he does have a huge hand in the direct sort of application of the U.S. space program as we sort of know it back then and sort of how it's been built off today. There's no taking that away, but also we don't want to paint him as any sort of good person, because he has a very dark history to himself as well. But let's move on a little bit. So while all of this was happening and the U.S. did, try and hire and rescue, quote unquote, these Nazi scientists to work on, rocket programs in the United States, the U.S. wasn't starting from zero. They also had their own system that was, or research laboratories that were working on this as well. And so they had one that was called the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Hunter, have you ever heard of this place?
I have. I have a colleague who worked there for a number of years, had, I believe, a postdoc there. So I only know a little bit about it, but I've heard of it for sure.
Right. Yeah. And probably more commonly referred to as JPL. And so JPL was founded in 1936. It was, federally funded research center that does almost exactly what it sounds like, right? It researches rockets, propulsion technology, and other things of that sort. Has made a lot of really great discoveries over the years. And in this way, it sort of acts as NASA's direct research and development arm. And that is also through the California Institute of Technology down there, Caltech.
It's in Southern California, right?
Right.
JPL.
Yeah. I used to go to a high school that was 1 mile away from JPL.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And so while JPL was, originally founded by three men, it was really one woman who was really foundational for a lot of the computational efforts behind a lot of this early work in rocketry that JPL was producing, right? This was a woman named Barbara Canwright. She was exceptionally good at math, very, very good at it. And it's worth noting here that this is before a time when computers could do all of this math for us. So this was all done by hand, right? So if you know anything about rocket science, and we talked a little about this earlier, it's that it takes an absolutely unreal amount of math. Right. You have to figure out the physics of where something's going, the, projection, sort of the fuel that's involved, basically everything, it's just math. It's all just math. And so Barbara, being so good at math, would become JPL's primary number cruncher, so to say, right? So she would have, I have here, a single experiment would take, weeks of calculations and fill up, up to 8 notebooks of just pure calculations. Now, I don't know about you, Hunter. That's my nightmare. I cannot do that level.
That would be tough for me. I think I have a lot of respect for people who can fill 8 notebooks full of math
and just be able to like follow it along and be able to come up with some sort of like reasonable answer, and also not have it. I mean, obviously these are all experiments and things go wrong all the time, but have something sort of logically fill out and actually work in the end is nothing short of magic to me.
Right. It might as well be magic for me as well, I think.
And so because, Barbara Canwright was so good at what she was doing, it wasn't long before JPL started recruiting this kind of a whole computing team to help Barbara with calculations. And they would go on to hire 2 more quote unquote computers, right? Because that's what they were before computers that we use today.
The people were the computers. Yeah.
The people were the computers. And this would be 2 other women named Virginia Prettyman and Macy Roberts. And so this sort of created a kind of all women all-star team of people who kind of got a lot of the work done that we rely on today. So it's just kind of a fun, fascinating little side story around sort of the space race and sort of the involvement of JPL and American and women sort of tie into that story there. And I have here just, so while von Braun might be considered sort of this really intrinsic person, in sort of the space race, I think I would argue that Barbara Canwright had as much or more of an impact along with her team, just through her efforts as well. So, but with that said, let's get back and maybe finish up this segment with sort of an overview of sort of maybe some post-World War II geopolitics of space travel. That'll just sort of help us for sort of our next segment. So after World War II, kind of, much to the chagrin of the United States, the Soviet Union really made a lot of rapid progress towards space exploration. As we covered already a little bit, both countries had taken many of the best rocket scientists from post-war Germany and put them to work advancing their cause of space travel, as well as military rocketry. A lot of them were working on military stuff as well. But it would be the Soviets that would really divert substantial resources into new experiments around space travel. So at this time, the U.S. was still wholly focused on military efforts. They weren't thinking too much about space. And it was the Soviets that really sort of launched that effort. And have here that this would, propel, quote unquote, them to become, there's a lot of puns in this.
Yeah.
This would propel them to becoming the front runner in the space race for actually quite a while. And oftentimes we don't think about a lot of the early victories that the space race had. And so all of this early research from both the United States and Soviet Union would eventually culminate into one momentous moment in space history. And that is the launch of the Sputnik satellite. But before we get to the Sputnik satellite,
it's time for a brief ad break.
We got to do some ads. We got to make a little bit of money. So let's do that, and we will be right back. And we are back. This is the Geography is Everything podcast with Hunter and Geoff. We're talking about the geography is the space race. And so right now we've just ran through a lot of sort of history around sort of the beginnings of the space race, some of the World War II aspects of it, early rocketry, some of the people who were involved. Right now we're going to launch into some of the first actual things that are going up into space. But before we do that, I do want to just highlight very briefly that behind everything that we're talking about, basically from this point on for the rest of this episode, is all happening with sort of the US-Soviet Cold War happening in the background. And obviously, Hunter, the Cold War is a multi-part episode unto itself.
There's a lot to say about the Cold War, of course. And so it would be hard to just summarize. But yeah, that's the political context in which this is happening. The military and political cultural struggle between these two, what they would used to call superpowers.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it would be impossible. So instead of trying to do it at all, and basically doing a big old disservice to it. We're just going to mention that, everything we're talking about, it's happening back there. And a lot of what we're talking about today, it sort of feeds into the Cold War as well. Although I do prefer the more friendly term space race, because I think what we're going to find is that the space race, while it is a competition, it is a lot friendlier too. And so let's go ahead and jump to the launch of the Sputnik. Hunter, do you know what the Sputnik is?
I think it's a satellite, a Russian satellite.
It is. Yeah, it is exactly.
Good.
It's the very first human-made satellite that was launched into space, and so
the first one. Okay,
yeah, very first one. So Soviets beat the U.S. They were the first to be into space, and so on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union would successfully launch the first artificial satellite named Sputnik into space. The satellite was it was kind of a little sphere with 4 long antennae that circled the Earth, transmitting a repeating series of bleeps. And so if you can imagine, it's just like bleep, 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 right? Because they weren't, at that point, they weren't trying to actually gather any data. They just kind of wanted to get it up there and see if they could hear it and understand it and sort of still control it and connect to it, right?
Okay.
And at the time, it was an astonishing achievement. I mean, just imagine, there was, throughout entire human history before that, nothing that we had ever made had been up into space. We didn't know if it was even possible, right? So the fact that now that the Sputnik was up into space, that was huge for the planet.
A big moment.
Big moment. One that Time magazine described as the Soviets blowing a raspberry, quote unquote, at the United States.
That's putting the emphasis on the Cold War aspect of things.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, the scientists themselves, who knows what they're thinking about, but they might be thinking about, hey, this is the technology that we're interested in, not so much the political stuff.
Exactly. And I would argue, even today, in the modern day space race, the scientists are all mostly celebrating and congratulating each other, because in a lot of ways, their science, rises above a little bit the politicking that's happening a little bit below. And so, the Soviets would follow this impressive feat of engineering by then launching a dog named Laika into space. And so, unfortunately, as the technology to deorbit had not yet been developed, Laika's survival was never expected, and she did unfortunately pass away due to overheating hours into the flight, basically over the 4th orbit of the flight. But little was known about the effects of spaceflight on living creatures at the time of Laika's mission. So while we had been able to get a thing up there, or the Soviets had been able to get a thing up there, they still didn't know if that was something that a living being could even survive. The radiation, the weightlessness, right? There was no way for us to even conceive of what the impacts on humans or Earthlings could be. And so the experiment, which monitored Laika's vital signs, aimed to prove that a living organism could survive being launched into orbit and continue to function under conditions such as the weakened gravity and increased radiation, and provided scientists with some of the first data on biological effects of spaceflight.
It's one example in a history of examples of people using other species to
animal testing,
canary in the coal mine type situation, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
The more that time goes on, the more we'll, I think, probably be critical of moments like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly, it's kind of a very sad story, right? So, Laika, she will forever be remembered as the first Earthling to orbit Earth. I don't think anybody can take that away from her. There is a picture of her on Wikipedia. She was a very cute pup. But yes, I think, the use of animals in sort of testing is a well documented thing, and space flight is not immune from that as well. And so, just to keep us moving here, sort of, as all of this is happening, as the Soviets are sort of reaching these milestones, these early milestones, Sputnik, and just sort of, getting, Laika up into space, to make matters worse for the United States, their own satellite launch on December 6, 1957. So this would be just a couple months after Sputnik. It failed miserably. The rocket got just 1 meter off the ground before exploding into a huge fireball. So
did not go as planned. Yeah.
Not absolutely not his plan. Yeah. So it's at this point that sort of the US was realizing, like we are definitely falling behind here. And so I have here, according to the book Moon by Ben Moore, it's a, sort of a paraphrase quote. Shortly after this failure at the United Nations, the Soviet delegate sarcastically offered the U.S. representative help through a Soviet program that offered its superior technological know-how to backwards nations. Again, just highlighting some of the politicking that's going on.
Well, in the Cold War, every little thing, and there's examples from sports and culture and science and beyond military things, was perceived to be a victory in this Cold War, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Anything that they could grasp onto, right? And this, as you said, this would transcend through sports, for example, as well, right? These things that ultimately don't actually have that much bearing on sort of the actual politics involved, but that's not the point. But it was this failure, this December 6, 1957 failure and the Soviet Union's success that would directly lead to the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, more commonly known today as NASA.
NASA.
Yeah. And so the creation of NASA and the United States response. So I guess we'll talk a little bit about the creation of NASA and the United States response here. So I guess kind of, hurting after this humiliation, President Kennedy initiated a massive push to get the U.S. to the moon. And I don't think we can really underscore sort of what that meant at the time, because
not having been around during that time, some listeners were around at that time and have that kind of context. But in our life, that had already happened, and it's probably hard to perceive just how big a deal that probably was at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to think about, like, at this point, this is still the late 1950s. The U.S. has not had a successful satellite yet. The Soviets have had, a couple of kind of minor things, within relation to sort of where we're at today, right? They put a satellite into space. They put a dog named Laika into space. The moon was that. I mean, that's a whole other thing. That's unreal to even set that as a goalpost, right? It's almost inconceivable to expect that these scientists do that.
Right. And to get somebody there and back, right? I mean, that was
exactly. Yeah. So it wasn't just to get somebody there, but it was also, to return them home safely. And so, so NASA was created. So on July 29th, 1958, NASA was created under the National Aeronautics and Space Act. Shares the same acronym as NASA, so we won't use it as an acronym here. It should be noted here, however, that NASA was mostly formed out of an organization that was already around, right? So it was called this National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. So there was already the same expertise there. They weren't really starting over from scratch. And again, that's a lot of organizations, departments that are created. They're usually created out of something else. But apparently this original organization was still bound to the military part of the U.S. government. And, sort of friend of the pod here, Dwight Eisenhower, who we talk about actually kind of a lot, specifically wanted them to be separate. Though Kennedy was the president at the time of NASA's official founding, right? So this was back in sort of the mid 1950s when Dwight Eisenhower was still president. He made the decision that he wanted them to be separate. If you don't know all that much about Dwight Eisenhower, he actually had a pretty hard stance against the separation of military and sort of reducing the military, what he called a military industrial complex. I think that term might have been born out of one of his original quotes. But he had a pretty heavy hand in wanting these things to be separate so that NASA would be a civilian arm of the U.S. government and not a military arm, which is what the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics was. And so NASA, the organization we know and love today, would absorb about 8,000 employees from that original organization. And so just a few short years later, on May 25th, 1961, President Kennedy unveiled the Apollo mission, driven by the need to beat the Soviet Union. And so, according to Moon, once again, both sides saw it as a contest between capitalism and communism. So apparently, according to this book, if America could get to the moon first, it would prove that capitalism was superior, or so the logic went, and vice versa, right? So In a lot of ways, these two, quote unquote superpowers were using the space race to get up to the moon, the idea that we could reach the moon as just a way to track, is our system of governance better? Is it leading to more technological improvements? Is it leading to efficiencies and technological prowess, all these kinds of things, right?
Yeah, that's the subtext for the Cold War. Absolutely.
The subtext for the Cold War, right?
It's more than just who is going to be more powerful, but which political system, which economic system, proving that was the best one, proving that should be the one that everybody had.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, right. Because at this time, again, we're not getting into the Cold War too much, but at the time, right, there was definitely a concerted effort by both to influence other countries, for lack of a better, probably more accurate term, influence other countries to adopt their method of governmental control. And so that was sort of the logic around the space race is, this would prove once and for all, because how could what could possibly top that? This would prove once and for all whether capitalism was better or communism was better.
It's interesting that Apollo was the god of the sun, among other things, the god of sun and light.
That's true. I never thought about that they named their moon moon program after a god that's supposed to be the sun. And I'm not sure, I don't have it off the top of my head, but I'm not sure what the god of the moon was. Or
it was a goddess named Artemis. So maybe there's the gender thing has to play into it here with the male dominated space system or space agency. They pick Apollo over Artemis. I don't know.
That's interesting.
Went into those conversations?
Well, this is for next week's episode. We'll get to that later. But do you happen to know what the current space race or moon program is called that NASA is running?
I don't believe I do.
It's called Artemis.
Wow. Now it's all coming together for me.
And as I was doing all this massive amounts of research, those meanings just sort of flew over my head. It wasn't the focal point of what I was looking at.
Well, while we're on it, Mars is a Roman god of war.
Right. Yes. Which I did know. Yeah. Mars was the Roman god of war. And I'm not sure if what any of the programs are to get to Mars are called,
and that's just what we, in the United States and a bunch of other countries. I mean, there's probably different terms that reaches into different cultural traditions for different planets. But we've got Jupiter and we've got Venus and we've got Mars. We've chosen these ancient gods from Greek and Roman mythology. Yeah.
Well, we could talk a lot about sort of the history of gods and all this kind of stuff, which we kind of made a concerted effort to not do, but it seemed to tie naturally back in here. We're going to go ahead and jump to sort of our final ad break for the episode, and we're going to come back and we're going to talk a little bit more about the sort of the demonstration of technological supremacy sort of within the context of the space race and all this other stuff. So, and then we'll sort of launch or I guess end our episode today on maybe some of the significance of the moon landing, sort of what the cascading effects of that were. And so let's go ahead and do some ads.
We'll be right back.
And we are back. We are going to wrap up our first part of this 2-part series on the space race with sort of talking a little bit about some of the other achievements within the space race as it was happening kind of at the time. And we'll sort of lead into sort of the actual moon landing and all of that kind of stuff. So I think, as we left off last, before the ad break, we were talking a little bit about sort of NASA being founded and sort of the goal to put a man on the moon. And so while the United States at this time had a renewed effort around building up its space program by way of this Apollo program, the Soviet Union would kind of continue dunking on the U.S. for the early parts of the space race. Again, I think this ties a lot into maybe some of the history that we here in the United States are given. But I don't think there's a lot of emphasis put on the Soviet scientists accomplishments during this era. I think, maybe you hear about a little bit here and there, certainly Sputnik, but there was a lot of firsts that they accomplished, right? So they would put the first woman into space. This is cosmonaut Valentina, and I might mispronounce this, and I do apologize, but Valentina Tereshkova, and that would be on June 16th, 1963. Right. So that's, not that long after the Sputnik went up or Laika went up. It's only a few short years. They would perform the very first spacewalk. Hunter, do you know what a spacewalk is?
That's when a astronaut or cosmonaut gets out of the vessel, the ship, and is usually tethered to the space. Although there is an example of a U.S. astronaut who was not tethered and used some propulsion to sort of get around a little bit. That's quite a moment as well, but that's something else.
Right. Yeah. I think, usually tethered. I think there has been some limited, uses of I don't know, jetpacks. That is getting beyond my knowledge, but I think you are correct in that. But they would perform the very first spacewalk, the Soviets, on March 18th, 1965. Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov became the first person to leave a space capsule and, tethered to it, float freely in orbit. And so that's basically what a spacewalk is. So prior to that point, they'd all just still been within their spaceships or space capsules or whatever they were. They would also be the first to fly people into space and have them wear normal clothes rather than spacesuits the entire time. And so, this is something that is fairly common in, if you look at images of people on the International Space Station, for example, that's fairly common to see people wearing, not like streetwear, jeans and a t-shirt, but they're wearing clothes that would be broadly considered more normal than a spacesuit. Right.
Like a jumpsuit as opposed to a spacesuit.
Exactly. Right. Probably a little more comfortable, probably breathes a little bit better. Yeah. And so the Soviets, again, they would be the first to be able to do that. And so, although it's probably worth noting that, they're not sending people up, into space and down from space, even to this day, and just sort of, normal clothes. They are at that point wearing their spacesuits. Maybe at one point we'll get to that point where, sort of Star Trek, like you can just sort of be inside your normal streetwear and zip off. But the Apollo program, despite all of these firsts, the Apollo program was going after a much bigger fish, and that fish being the moon. And so while the Soviets, again, they were, constantly, achieving all these firsts, NASA, per the president of the United States at the time, had this one singular goal, which was to, reach the moon and back. And so I have here, in today's dollars, the Apollo program cost the United States about $178 billion. So that's a lot. That's for a single program. Although it was all encompassing at the time for NASA, but they were doing some other stuff as well. So it wasn't like their entire budget. To put that in perspective, NASA's annual budget today is about $25 billion per year. And so that's spread out across multiple different programs and arms of NASA. And so
a lot more funding in the context of the Cold War.
A lot more funding. Of course, it's hard because I couldn't find exactly NASA's budget, how it was broken out through the years. I can just tell that this is over a number of years, but it's still, going towards one program. It's still, no matter how you sort of slice it, it's a lot more money towards a single program than NASA is doing today. And so, like I said before, the program had a singular goal, and this is as quoted by President Kennedy: landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. Right. So that was one line goal, right? That's your mission statement for NASA. Apollo, the program would run from 1961 to 1972. With the first crewed flight in 1968. And so we're now at this point about 10 years after Sputnik had gone up into space. And of course, at this point, NASA has gotten other things into space. They're not like doing nothing, right? There's the Explorer 1 satellite goes up into space some point, before this, all this kind of stuff. So NASA is still working on these other technologies. But again, this isn't their goal. They're at that point, they're not trying to one up the Soviet Union in any respects around sort of satellites or merely getting people up into space. Right? They're entirely focused almost on getting somebody to the moon. And so the program would actually suffer a really major setback when a cabin fire would kill the entire Apollo 1 crew. And so this would be the first sort of Apollo crew that they would try and launch up into space, and unfortunately they would perish. Eventually, of course, the enormous U.S. budget did pay off. The Apollo 11 mission would land Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon on July 20th, 1969. Right, so this is now 12 years after the Sputnik went up. And so again, according to Moon, the book by Ben Moore, the competition to get up there first had been fierce with the Soviets pushing just as hard, but both sides had learned a great deal from each other as well. And I think this goes back and just sort of alludes to the fact that scientists were a little bit above the political fray a little bit. They wanted to win. Obviously, they had a healthy competition with each other, but they weren't above using and learning from each other as well. And I think that's an important thing to take away, and is that the scientists were as much in competition as they were in partnership with each other, despite being on these sort of polar ends of this political spectrum. And in the end, it's clear that the moon landing really kind of owed its collective efforts to all of the scientists from the Soviet Union and the United States and Europe and a bunch of different other places. Right, it wasn't just bipolar. It wasn't just the United States and Soviet Union. There were scientists everywhere. The men and the women. Right, we talked a lot about both in today's episode, and just sort of all of their collective, endeavors, all of the math they did, all of the projects they run, each one built a little bit of the piece of the puzzle towards actually, allowing NASA to land a few people on the moon in 1969. And so in this way, the space race, while originally kind of born out of the Cold War, almost kind of became more of a uniting factor for the world in a lot of ways, right? It's, and it's something that kind of persists today. And we'll talk a little bit about that in next week's episode. So, space continues to be, mostly the realm of healthy competition and collaboration rather than outright hostility. We'll see how this sort of evolves over the coming decades. But I think up to this point, even today, that's still the case.
It's interesting that the total number of people who've been on the moon, who've placed a foot on the moon, is 12 people. Yeah. So it's interesting that there's this enormous focus to get to the moon, enormous expense, this part of the space race that we're talking about. And then they put a few more people on the moon, and then that's not a priority anymore, apparently.
Yeah. I think there was, and I didn't dive too much into this, but I did try and research a little bit about that. Basically, why did we stop? And I think there was an aspect of, well, okay, been there, done that. We collected our moon samples. What more is there for us to learn about this otherwise kind of desolate area? This would also be well before the time of sort of modern day technologies that would actually allow more consistent human habitation up there, right? So this is, for example, this is before the International Space Station was even sort of a twinkle in anybody's eye.
Right. So we have an International Space Station, but there's no space station on the moon.
There's no space station on the moon, but there was no way to, with the expense to get people to the moon, there was no way to keep people there or to even understand how that would work. And so while getting to the moon was an impressive scientific and engineering feat, I think they hit sort of a natural technologic limit in, why are we going to, or I guess I should say there was a natural limit to the return on investment of continuing to send people up there. It's like, okay, well, you can go up there, you can bounce around for a little bit. It'll be a lot of fun. You'll have a hoot. But we have enough rocks and we just can't do very much more with it at this point. And I think what we're going to find is that with today's space race, that equation has changed a little bit. And so there are bigger aspirations now.
Well, and then the other thing, we're talking about the symbolic power of landing on the moon, is the first NASA astronauts put a U.S. flag on the moon, right? I mean, that's pretty bold move, right?
That's a pretty bold move. Yeah. So, well, let's talk about some of the symbolic significance of the moon landing, because this is kind of what we're going to end our episode on today is what did all of this culminate to? What was the point? Why? It's fun to say, you were first at doing something, but there's undercurrents involved in all of this, right? So, I think the first thing is just to talk about is, when we talked about this briefly already, is the proof of technological superiority that was
right.
very
supposed
important.
Proof, right? I mean, that's the argument that's being made, right?
Right. I mean, exactly. These aren't my arguments. These are things that I sort of found, in various works.
Right. Yeah.
And so, according to sort of some logic here, by landing on the moon, the U.S. was able to demonstrate its technological prowess and innovation to the world, right? And so that was very important for them at the time, especially, in trying to, while NASA is not a military operation, being able to show that, hey, we can get somebody on the moon. You're not going to beat us in sort of the technological race. We are so far above and beyond. And so really it symbolized the nation's ability to achieve scientific breakthroughs and showed its leading role in technological advancement. Now, of course, as we already discussed, the scientists, they're all kind of working together, right? They're not, I mean, obviously there are secrets that aren't being traded back and forth between countries, but if the Soviet Union blasted something up into space, you know that there were US and European scientists that were studying and looking at that and figuring out how, and all this kind of stuff, and vice versa, right? And so maybe not directly working in collaboration with each other, but very much still working in collaboration and wanting to achieve more for everybody's benefit. The US just happened to be able to build off all these things at the right time and get onto the moon first. Just to keep us moving here, there was, go back to the Cold War a little bit. There's sort of the within the context of the Cold War, sort of reaching the moon first was seen as kind of a significant victory over the Soviet Union. I don't know how much the people in Russia actually perceive that. I think we have, obviously, here in the United States, we have a very U.S.-centric view of that achievement.
Yeah, we make a pretty big deal out of it, right?
We make a pretty big deal out of it. And, if I can sort of assume that, people who are in Russia or people who were living in Soviet Union at the time, they probably made a pretty big deal of Sputnik and being the first in the space and doing all of their first, right? Because as much as getting to the moon was, pretty phenomenal and pretty, monumental for humanity and the United States, just getting people up into space was also very monumental, right?
Right. So with a history lesson in Russia and a history lesson in the United States are going to be emphasizing different things. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but that said, the space race was a significant aspect of the competition between these two superpowers. So this accomplishment, it was seen, at least within the United States and maybe within some of the other European and Western nations, as a demonstration of quote unquote, capitalist or, U.S. superiority. I don't know. This is stuff that I've found in my research. What I will say is probably true, though, is that the space race, NASA getting on the moon, definitely, I think, had a huge impact on the national unity and pride for people living in the United States. I don't think that's too far to jump out in front of it. It seemed pretty
it's
monumental.
Not widespread to every individual necessarily, but that this creates a moment where people identify with being from a particular place and a particular country, and that's celebrated. And so again, how widespread that was depends on the individual, but it was this huge moment where
and I think you can culturally track it. There was a time when NASA was very popular, right? There was toys being sold that were like little NASA spaceships. There was, they were like culturally very, commanding in a lot of ways.
Well, I mean, Toy Story teaches us this, that, right? We go from the cowboy being the emblematic hero of kids in the 50s and little boys, maybe perhaps in particular. And then that gets displaced by Buzz Lightyear, right? And so that's the rise of a new form of a hero or something like that replaces sort of the more antiquated one. And that's one that's driven by technology and space travel and all this.
I've only seen Toy Story 1. I haven't seen any of the
Whoa,
sequels.
spoiler alert. Sorry, I didn't mean to blow it for you.
No. But what I was going to say was that I think I only saw Toy Story 1. I only saw it when I was, I don't know, probably, young. And I think that particular messaging probably escaped me, that particular analogy right there. But I definitely see the it tracking, right? They became heroes for a lot of people. And that was a big part of the branding appeal of NASA. And we're actually not going to talk like all that much about NASA as a brand, but actually we're not going to talk about it at all. I don't have it here in my notes, but I think it is worth calling out that NASA has become a very powerful kind of global marketing.
You can
brand.
buy NASA t-shirts at Target,
Yeah, you can buy. Yeah,
I see people wearing NASA shirts all the time, actually.
Yeah, it's very popular, and they'll bring back old logos, right? And now that'll be a whole new sort of thing. And I've seen it in places that traveling abroad, for example. I've seen NASA clothes and stuff like that. So there is an appeal to that brand, probably based a lot on sort of what they originally accomplished here. I think it is worth pointing out that landing on the moon did have some symbology towards more of a peaceful and cooperative existence, sort of globally. So despite being part of the competition with the Soviet Union, the moon landing, kind of did carry a message of peace and international cooperation, right? So the plaque left by Apollo 11 astronauts reads, we came in peace for all mankind. Of course, they also left the American flag there, the U.S. flag.
Right. And then they're using the term mankind, which today would probably use humankind.
Would be humankind, exactly.
A sign of the times.
A sign of the times, but also, I think it's just important to call out that, and again, I think Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and I can't remember the third person's name off the top of my head right
because he didn't get to step on the moon, right?
Yeah. I should have internalized that one a little bit more, but I don't have it here in my notes. But I think, they were very much more on the side of the scientists rather than the politicking, right? They weren't necessarily trying to one up anybody. They were really just trying to focus on doing something monumental that no human had ever done before. And so
Michael Collins
was
the command module pilot. So
all right, Michael.
Yeah. Little shout out to the Collins people.
Yeah. And so maybe we'll just end this episode with that. This is, obviously the original space race had a huge impact on a lot of technologies that are around today. And has also had a lot of impact on sort of where we're going to go next, which is kind of the modern-ish space race. And the reason why I say modern-ish is because we're going to actually start next week sort of still in the past a little bit, because there's some things that we just can't not talk about when we're talking about space exploration. And so with that, Hunter, anything left? Do you want to do some pluggables or?
Yeah, sure. I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I am co-author of Portlandist, a Cultural Atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle with David Banis. And I am the co-host of this podcast with you, Geoff. Geography is everything.
Yeah, thanks. And my name is Geoff Gibson. You can find me on YouTube. That's youtube.com/geography by Geoff. If you want to find more of my geography stuff, that is. Otherwise, I am the co-host here at the Geography is Everything podcast with Hunter. And you can find us over on Substack if you want even more geography content. There's some perks there. You can sign up for a premium subscription and get access to some really neat stuff that we're building over there. So hopefully you join us over there. You can also just subscribe for free. That is totally fine. We're just trying to build up a fun little geography community. And so you can find that at geographyeverything, all one word, .substack.com. And then finally, I always like to make this call at the very end of our podcast episodes. But if you liked what you heard today, you really enjoyed learning about the original space race and sort of all of our little anecdotes and jokes and puns involved, please go and rate and review us on kind of whatever app you use to listen to podcasts. I know, for example, on Apple Podcasts, that's a big part of it. But if your podcast app du jour has that option, please do it over there as well. We really appreciate that. I personally really love seeing those reviews. There's a lot of really good ones that are coming in. And it just really makes me feel happy and like we're doing something fun here and things that people enjoy. So with that, we will, we'll come back next week and we'll finish up our 2-part series on the space race. We're going to talk a lot more about the modern space race. We're going to talk about a little bit of the lead up to that, sort of who are the players now, sort of everything that's sort of happening today. Because if you didn't know, there's actually quite a lot going on right now.
Thank you for listening, and please join us next time.